She was 7 months pregnant, watching from a diner booth as the truck that had followed her from the police station sat parked outside. She'd come straight from the station. She'd shown them the photos, the voicemails, the exact words he'd said to her. Calm, smiling 2 nights ago, there's nothing we can do, so she crossed the room. She sat down next to the man everyone else was avoiding. Leather vest, tattoos from wrist to collar, Hell's Angels patch on his back. She leaned close and whispered, "Nobody believes me." What he did next would put a man in handcuffs and leave a seasoned police detective completely speechless. She had organized everything into a folder on her phone and labeled it proof. Not proof of something she doubted, proof for whoever would need convincing, and she knew there would be someone. There was always someone who needed convincing when a woman said she was afraid of the man who came home to her at night. The folder held 9 voicemails, 11 photographs, and 3 screenshots of text messages, arranged in chronological order. She had been meaning to show this folder to someone for 6 weeks. Today, finally, she was going to. The waiting room of the Knox County Police Department smelled of stale coffee and industrial floor cleaner. A fluorescent tube above the intake desk flickered on a steady interval, and Hazel Brennan had been counting the intervals for 43 minutes. She sat with both hands resting over the curve of her belly, 7 months along now, the baby riding low and heavy, pressing against her lower ribs with each breath. She wore a grey maternity top, washed too many times, and dark jeans she'd left unbuttoned at the waist since early October. She looked like what she was, a woman who had been managing on not quite enough of everything for longer than she could clearly remember. She had rehearsed what she would say on the drive over. In the parking lot, she'd stayed in the car for 11 minutes, running through it twice more. She would be specific. She would be calm. She had learned, somewhere across the last 2 years of living with Tommy Reed, that tears on a woman's face make certain kinds of people mistake the tears for the problem. Detective Bruce Whitfield came out to get her at 2:17 in the afternoon. He was somewhere in his late 50s, grey moustache in need of trimming, with the settled posture of a man who had heard every version of every situation and found most of them smaller than advertised. He led her to a consultation room off the main corridor, beige walls, a table bolted to the floor, 2 plastic chairs, and set a yellow legal pad on the surface in front of him with the deliberateness of someone performing readiness. She told him about Tommy. 3 years together. The first year had been real, not the kind of past that gets rewritten to explain how you arrived somewhere, but genuinely good, or at least not bad. Tommy Reed was 31, worked logistics at a regional distribution centre off Lovell Road, kept the apartment clean, called his mother every Sunday. He had an open, easy face that read as trustworthy in under 5 minutes. He presented well. That phrase had come to her recently and wouldn't leave. He presented well. The careful ones always do. The second year, the edges began to show. He corrected her in front of his friends, gently, always gently, with the tone of someone doing her a favor. He checked her phone while she slept. He made observations about her weight in the constructive voice of a man who considers himself helpful. By the 3rd year, she had built an internal weather system calibrated to the weight of his footsteps on the stairs and the pitch of his breathing when he came through the door. By the time she was 4 months pregnant, she was deliberate about how she loaded the dishwasher. She showed Whitfield the photograph of the kitchen cabinet, splintered wood, a hole the approximate shape and size of a human fist. He glanced at it. That could have happened a number of ways. He put his fist through it. I was 3 feet away. Were there any witnesses? She pressed her palm flat against her belly. The baby was still. He makes sure there aren't. Whitfield's pen moved briefly across the legal pad. She tilted her head to read it and couldn't. She had the strong impression he had written nothing at all. Has he physically harmed you? The tone was flat, not unkind, but worn smooth of investment by repetition. Not yet. This was the part she'd rehearsed most carefully. But 2 nights ago, he told me clearly that if I left and took the baby, I wouldn't make it to the county line. People say things when they're upset. He wasn't upset. She held Whitfield's eyes and did not look away. That's exactly what frightened me. He was completely calm. The detective folded his hands on the table and delivered what she now understood was a prepared answer, assembled before she'd walked through the door, without documented physical harm, without a formal incident on record. Encouragement to stay with family, resources she could access, if anything escalated. "I don't have family here," she said. "There are shelters. I came to the police first because I thought that was the appropriate first step." The room held a quiet long enough for the overhead light to pulse 3 times. She walked out of the station into a grey October afternoon. The sky over Knoxville was the colour of old pewter, and the temperature had dropped while she was inside. She hadn't brought a coat. She'd left in a hurry that morning, and her coat was still on the hook by the front door, where Tommy would see it when he came home from his shift and understand that she'd left in a hurry. She hadn't gone back for it. She drove without a destination for 15 minutes. The gas gauge showed a quarter tank. By tomorrow that would be a problem. She turned off Cumberland Avenue onto a side street she didn't recognize and spotted the lot of a Gulf station with a small diner attached. A painted sign above the door reading Lena's in faded red letters, the apostrophe missing, a handwritten "We're open" taped inside the window. She needed to sit. She needed warmth and stillness and something to hold in her hands while she figured out what came next, because what came next was a problem she had not yet solved. She pushed through the glass door and stopped. He was at the end of the counter, last stool before the corner, both forearms resting flat on the surface, a ceramic mug held loosely between his large hands. The mug looked undersized in his grip. He was a big man, tall and wide in the way of someone built by years and labor rather than intention, wearing a black leather vest over a long-sleeved grey shirt. The patch on the back was visible even from across the room, a grinning skull beneath a winged helmet, and in red and gold letters arching above and below it, Hell's Angels, Knoxville. His arms were covered in ink from wrist to collar, and the tattoos continued up the side of his neck. His hair was dark with grey pushing through at the temples. He wore a short beard, two-toned the same way. He was probably in his mid-40s, though the lines beside his eyes suggested a life that counted in a different currency than years. He didn't look up when she walked in. He was looking into his mug. Hazel took a booth by the window, the one with a sight line to the door. She ordered herbal tea and chicken soup, the 2 warmest things on the menu. When the tea arrived, she wrapped both hands around the mug and looked out at the grey October street. The baby shifted inside her. A slow, deliberate movement, like someone turning over in a dream. She pressed her palm flat against her belly and made a promise. Quiet, private, and completely binding. Then she looked out at the street and waited and tried to think. She hadn't planned to speak to him. She'd been watching the parking lot through the window, watching, as she watched every parking lot now, for the white Ford F-150. When she saw it turn off Cumberland Avenue, slow, and stop at the curb, half a block down the street. Engine off, just sitting there. Her hands went still around the mug. Tommy was patient in the particular way that people who need control are patient. Without urgency, because they have already done the math and don't need to rush. He knew she'd eventually have to leave the diner. He knew she'd eventually need her clothes, her hospital bag, the things that a woman 7 months pregnant cannot simply walk away from. He knew she'd already been to the police station. He probably knew before she pulled into their parking lot, and he knew, with an accuracy that had taken her 2 years to fully understand, exactly what they would have told her. He had smiled at her 2 nights ago after saying what he'd said. That detail lived in her chest like a stone, not the words, the smile. She became aware, without clearly deciding to move, that she was crossing the diner floor. The man at the counter didn't look up when she approached. Up close, the vest was worn leather with frayed patches, and beneath the main Hells Angels insignia, a smaller secondary patch read Road Captain. His hands around the mug were scarred at the knuckles, old scars, fully healed, white against the ink. The tattoo visible on the side of his neck, just above the collar of his shirt, was an eagle in flight, the detail in the wings precise enough to suggest that whoever put it there had taken their time. She sat down on the stool beside him. In the single second between sitting and the first word, the full weight of what she was doing arrived. She had just placed herself 7 months pregnant next to a Hells Angel, in a diner where she realized only now no one else had sat within 4 stools of him. He looked at her. His eyes were dark brown and steady, not performing friendliness, not performing threat. They moved from her face to her belly and back without hurry, taking a simple inventory of the situation. "You doing okay?" His voice was low and unhurried, the kind that doesn't need volume. She looked at her hands on the counter, then at the window. "There's a truck out there that followed me from the police station." He turned his head to the window, turned it back. "I was at the station today," she continued. She wasn't entirely sure why she was telling him this. Exhaustion, perhaps, the absence of anywhere else to put it. "I showed them evidence. I told them I was frightened. They said there was nothing they could do." She looked at the counter surface. "I don't know what I'm doing. I'm sorry for sitting here." She started to stand. "You don't have to go," he said. Not an invitation, just a fact, offered plainly. She sat back down. The waitress at the far end of the counter had been monitoring them with the practiced attention of someone deciding whether to intervene. She had decided not to, but she hadn't stopped watching. "Is he the father?" the man asked. "Yes." "He knows you're here?" She looked at the white truck at the curb. "I think he followed me." He nodded once, a slow, confirmatory movement, like someone clicking a piece into place. He set down his mug and shifted slightly toward her, not aggressively, just orienting himself the way a person does when they've decided something deserves their full attention. "What did he threaten you with?" she told him. Without the rehearsed precision she'd used in Whitfield's consultation room, just the plain version, the one without armor, the voicemails, the photographs, the cabinet, the 2 nights ago when Tommy had stood in the kitchen in the light spilling from the open refrigerator and told her what would happen if she left, and then had smiled, and the smile had been worse than anything he'd said. He listened. He did not check his phone. He did not arrange his face into the expression of someone being politely patient while waiting for a pause. He listened the way very few people do, like the only thing in the room was what she was saying. When she finished, the diner was quiet around them. Someone behind her was paying their check. The cook was moving pans in the kitchen. Somewhere down the counter, a radio was playing low. "Nobody believes me," she said. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out barely above a whisper, pressed thin by the weight of carrying it all day, all week, all the weeks before that. He held her gaze for a long, steady moment. "I believe you," he said. 3 words. She had prepared herself for many possible responses during the walk across the diner floor. She had not prepared for what those 3 words felt like. Not like rescue thrown from a distance, but like solid ground under her feet. "My name's Ryder," he said. "Hazel." He nodded once. "How far along?" 7 months. "Boy or girl?" "I don't know yet. I wanted it to be a surprise." She almost smiled, because it was such an ordinary thing to say inside such an extraordinary afternoon. The bell above the diner door rang. The smile didn't arrive. Tommy Reed walked in. He looked good, as he consistently did. Dark pressed jeans, a canvas jacket, his hair neat. He had the kind of face that reads, at first meeting, as someone you'd trust to give you directions. He scanned the diner quickly, found Hazel, and let his expression arrange itself into something a stranger might have read as relief. He didn't register Ryder until he'd already taken 3 steps toward her. He stopped. Ryder had not moved. He sat exactly as he'd been sitting, both forearms on the counter, mug between his hands, except for a subtle recalibration in the quality of his stillness. He was looking at Tommy Reed with no anger, no challenge, no performance, only attention. The absolute unhurried kind that doesn't miss anything. Tommy's open expression recalibrated. Hazel. His voice was the measured, reasonable one he used in public spaces, the one that had fooled her for a year and his acquaintances for much longer. "I've been worried. You left without saying anything." "She's had a difficult afternoon," Ryder said. His tone was conversational. "I think she could use some space." The word space landed in the room with unexpected weight, not aggressive, but with the quiet certainty of a door held closed. Tommy looked at Ryder with the flat assessment of someone calculating variables he hadn't accounted for. Several seconds passed. The waitress at the end of the counter had gone completely still. "I wasn't talking to you," Tommy said. "I know," Ryder said. He still hadn't moved. He didn't need to. Tommy looked at Hazel. She saw it. The thing behind his face, the thing that lived back there behind the open expression and the reasonable voice. The calculation. He was deciding. He was always deciding. "We'll talk later," he said to her. Soft, specific, the voice she had learned over 2 years to fear far more than shouting ever. He left. The bell above the door rang once behind him. Hazel set down her mug. Her hands were shaking, and she became aware of that only when she saw them against the counter. "He'll come back," she said. "Probably," Ryder said. He was already pulling out his phone. "You got somewhere safe to go tonight?" The pause that followed was its own answer. He made a call. 2 sentences, no names. Hung up. "My brother's got a house about 4 miles from here. His wife's home. You okay to drive?" Hazel pressed both hands flat on the counter and waited for them to steady. "Yeah," she said. "I can drive." It was after midnight when the pain began. Not the sharp, clarifying pain she had been warned to watch for in her prenatal appointments. Not the kind that announces itself and demands immediate response. This was lower and more insistent, a pressure that built on itself with each passing hour, accompanied by a tightening across her abdomen that came and went in waves too irregular to be contractions and too persistent to be nothing. She had been lying on the couch in Cindy Morrow's living room, unable to sleep, watching the shadows on the ceiling shift as headlights moved past on the street outside. Ryder was somewhere in the kitchen. She'd heard him moving around in there an hour ago, and since then he'd been quiet, the way people go quiet when they're thinking about something they can't resolve by thinking about it. She pressed her hands to her belly and waited for the tightness to ease. It eased. Then it returned. Ryder. He appeared in the doorway in under 10 seconds, which told her he hadn't been sleeping either. "Something doesn't feel right," she said. He was across the room and crouching at the edge of the couch before she finished the sentence. He didn't fuss or hover. He leveled himself to her eyeline, put one hand on the back of the couch, not on her, just near, and asked, in a voice with no alarm in it, "Can you walk?" "Yes." "Then let's go." The University of Tennessee Medical Center's emergency entrance was 4.5 miles from the Morrow House on Holston Hills Road, and Ryder made the drive in 8 minutes without running a single red light. He checked each intersection and moved through carefully, with the precise, unhurried focus of someone who has driven at speed before and learned the difference between urgency and recklessness. Hazel noticed this and filed it away in the part of her mind that had been quietly assembling an accurate picture of who he was. The intake nurse at the ER desk moved quickly when she saw Hazel's belly. A second nurse, Alison Parks, according to her badge, dark-haired and efficient, came from behind the triage station and walked Hazel to a curtained bay, asking questions in the rapid, steady rhythm of someone who has done this work for years and learned to read answers in a patient's face as much as in their words. Ryder followed them as far as the triage threshold. That was where the atmosphere of the room shifted. The hospital corridor at 1 in the morning was bright and clinical and quiet, populated by night shift staff in scrubs, and Ryder Calloway moved through it in his leather vest and his ink, like a different kind of weather entirely. Hazel, looking back from the curtained bay, saw the intake nurse make eye contact with a security guard positioned near the vending machines. Saw the guard straighten and push off from the wall. Saw the way 2 nurses near the station leaned toward each other briefly before both looked away. They saw what most people saw. A large man covered in tattoos, wearing a motorcycle club's colors, following a pregnant woman through an emergency room at 1 in the morning. What they didn't see, that he was the one who'd driven her here, that he had listened to her that afternoon in a way that no one else in her day had bothered to. That his voice, asking if she could walk, had been the calmest thing she'd heard in 2 days. Parks ran vitals, assessed the pattern of the pain, ordered a fetal monitor. Blood pressure, 148/94. Parks noted it carefully and told Hazel they'd watch it. The baby's heartbeat on the monitor was strong and constant, a sound that Hazel felt in the base of her sternum. Braxton Hicks, most likely, aggravated by stress, Parks said. The blood pressure is something we want to monitor. We'll keep you here a few hours. She glanced at the curtain. Is there someone here with you? He's waiting outside. Parks looked at the curtain again. A brief, involuntary thing, the kind that happens before a person can intercept it. You're safe here, she said gently. She meant it. And she was looking at the curtain when she said it. The person outside is the reason I'm safe, Hazel said quietly. Parks met her eyes. Had the expression of someone who's just been handed information that doesn't fit the template she arrived with. I'll let him know you're comfortable, she said, and stepped out. Ryder was permitted to the waiting area just outside the bay. He found the chair nearest her curtain and folded himself into it, a chair demonstrably not designed for a man of his dimensions, which he occupied without comment, with the unconcern of someone accustomed to spaces not built with him in mind. He stayed there. At 2:40 in the morning, Tommy Reed walked into the UT Medical Center emergency room. Hazel heard his voice before she saw him, the even, public-facing version of it, the one that had worked on her for a year and on strangers for much longer. He was speaking to someone at the intake desk. He must have tracked her car in the lot or deduced her location. He knew she had no family in the city, and there were only so many places a woman alone could go at midnight. She pulled the curtain back an inch. The security guard who had been watching Ryder since he arrived was now moving toward the intake desk with a noticeably different energy. Alert, yes, but not concerned. Tommy spoke quietly and reasonably. He used the word worried. He said her name. She watched Ryder stand. He was positioned between Tommy and her bay before Tommy finished his sentence to the guard. He hadn't moved fast or visibly. He was simply there, arms loose at his sides, saying nothing. He didn't need to say anything. His position in the corridor said everything. "Sir," the security guard said, stepping forward, and it took Hazel a half-second to understand that the "sir" was directed at Ryder. "He's not the problem," she said from the curtain gap. Both men turned. Tommy arranged his expression into the relief of a worried partner. "I just want to know you're okay." "She's okay," Ryder said. The guard looked between them, working to reorient a picture that kept refusing to resolve the way he'd expected it to. Nurse Parks appeared around the corner, assessed the corridor in 3 seconds flat, and went directly to the nursing station phone. When she returned, she addressed Tommy with the quiet authority of someone who has handled difficult situations inside hospital walls before. "Sir, without patient approval, I need you to wait in the main lobby." Tommy's smile held for exactly 3 seconds. Then he left. Hazel let the curtain fall. She sat on the edge of the bed and placed her hands in her lap. They were not shaking. She noticed that and was genuinely glad. Outside the curtain, she heard Ryder settle back into his undersized chair. Ryder. Yeah. She looked at the fetal monitor, the baby's heartbeat, clean and constant, drawn in green light across the small screen. "Why are you doing this?" The pause that followed was long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Because someone needed to," he said, "and I was there." She lay back against the pillow. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm. Down the hall, someone was crying softly, and a nurse was speaking to them in the low, continuous murmur of someone who knows that sometimes the most useful thing is simply to stay. She closed her eyes. She let herself rest. The baby turned slowly inside her, and the monitor kept its watch, and outside the curtain, the large man in the leather vest remained in his chair and did not leave. At 6:47 in the morning, while the hospital completed its shift change and Hazel was sleeping, and the corridor outside her bay had gone quiet, Ryder Calloway walked to the nursing station and asked to speak with whoever handled security coordination. What he placed on the desk was not a threat, not a demand, not a request for anything. It was a phone. On the phone were 11 items. The first 9 were voicemails Tommy Reed had left on Hazel's cell over the previous 6 weeks. Messages she'd saved in the folder labeled Proof, the same folder Detective Whitfield had glanced at for 4 seconds and set aside. Ryder had asked to hear all 9 of them the night before, sitting in the chair outside her curtain. He'd listened to each one without expression. Then he'd asked if he could make copies. She'd said yes, without hesitation. The 10th item was a recording she hadn't known existed. 3 weeks prior, sitting in the parking lot of the Knox County Police Department, before she went inside, before she rehearsed her statement, before the fluorescent lights and the yellow legal pad, Tommy had called her. She'd answered on speaker, her phone lying face up on the passenger seat. She had downloaded a call recording application 6 weeks earlier in a careful, precautionary moment, and had then largely forgotten about it. The call had lasted 11 minutes. Tommy had said, in the specific calm of a man who has convinced himself he will never be held accountable, exactly what he intended to do. Tennessee is a one-party consent state. The recording was clean, clear, and complete. The 11th item was video. When Ryder had texted Vince from the diner the previous afternoon, he'd included the hospital name. Vince had arrived at 1:20 in the morning with the dash cam on his truck running on continuous loop, angled toward the emergency entrance. It had recorded Tommy Reed pulling into the lot at 2:33 a.m., 7 minutes before he walked through the doors. It had recorded him sitting in his car during those 7 minutes without calling anyone, without moving, exhibiting none of the behavior of a man genuinely concerned about someone he loved. It had recorded him leaving after the nurses turned him away. It had recorded him returning at 4:15 a.m., sitting in the lot for 12 more minutes in the dark, and then driving away again. Ryder laid all of it out for the security coordinator methodically, without editorializing, in the tone of someone presenting facts rather than arguments. Sergeant Dan Briggs arrived at the hospital at 7:15. He was 49, compact, with a deliberate manner that had none of the finished indifference Hazel had encountered 20 hours earlier across a bolted table in a beige room. He reviewed what Ryder had assembled. He asked for Hazel, who was awake by then and sitting up in the bed with morning light crossing the window sideways. She told him everything. From the beginning, the same way she'd told it the day before in the station, but this time, across the table from her, a different person was listening. By 8:30, Briggs had 2 officers in the parking lot. Tommy's truck was still there. He had returned a 3rd time sometime in the early morning hours and hadn't left. They found him asleep in the driver's seat, keys in the ignition, slumped against the window of a vehicle parked 60 feet from the building where the woman he'd threatened was sleeping. The arrest took 4 minutes and required no force. Hazel didn't see it. She was still in the bay when Nurse Parks came in to check her vitals and said simply and directly, "It's done." Hazel placed both palms flat against her belly. The baby shifted, a small, rolling movement, unhurried, comfortable. She breathed slowly and let the morning come in through the window. Detective Bruce Whitfield arrived at 9:20. He was there because the arrest of Thomas Reed on charges of criminal threatening of a pregnant person, aggravated stalking, and criminal harassment had generated a report bearing his name. Protocol required follow-up. He came down the corridor with the particular walk of a man who already understood that the room he was walking into contained something he was going to have to look at honestly. He stopped in the corridor outside Hazel's Bay and read the file Briggs had assembled, the voicemails, the parking lot footage, the 11-minute recording from 3 weeks prior, the timeline of 3 separate hospital visits across a single night. He read it the way you read something that is telling you an inconvenient truth about yourself and your own choices. Ryder was leaning against the wall approximately 10 feet away, arms folded, waiting for nothing in particular. Whitfield didn't notice him immediately. He was still looking at the file when he looked up and found Ryder there. The two men regarded each other from 10 feet of hospital corridor. Whitfield had the expression of a person trying to reconcile a picture that keeps producing the wrong result. He went into the bay. "Miss Brennan, detective." He stood at the foot of the bed with the file open in his hands. He had the look of someone who has decided to do something uncomfortable and is committed to doing it properly. "The materials compiled overnight." "He listened to me," Hazel said. "That's where it started. He just listened." Whitfield looked toward the doorway, where the edge of Ryder's leather vest was visible beyond the curtain's edge. He was quiet for a moment. Outside in the hall, a breakfast cart moved past with a sound of rattling trays. "I owe you an apology," Whitfield said. She looked at him steadily. "Yes, you do." He absorbed that without deflecting it or minimizing it. He nodded once, and the nod carried the weight of someone who had arrived at an uncomfortable destination and decided to stay there rather than look for the exit. He came back out of the bay and past Ryder in the corridor. He stopped. "You did good work," Whitfield said. Ryder's expression didn't shift. "I did what needed doing." Whitfield held his gaze for a moment longer than required. Then he walked away down the corridor, and his footsteps were slower going out than they'd been coming in. Hazel watched it through the gap in the curtain. She lowered herself back against the pillow. The room was quiet. Outside the window, Knoxville was completing its arrival into morning. Traffic building on the overpass, the sky moving from grey to a pale, tentative blue, the kind of blue that feels like something's starting. "Ryder," she said it to the curtain. He appeared in the doorway. "Come sit down," she said. "You've been standing all night." He came in. He lowered himself into the small chair beside the bed, the same inadequate chair he'd occupied outside her curtain for hours, and he sat with his hands on his knees and looked at the floor for a moment. "Thank you," she said. He looked up. His brown eyes were tired and entirely steady. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "You've still got about 8 weeks ahead of you." She laughed. It surprised her, the laugh and the surprise of it both. He almost smiled. Just barely. Almost. Outside the window, Knoxville finished waking up. 3 weeks after Tommy Reed was led from a hospital parking lot in handcuffs, a photograph appeared on the front page of the Knoxville Sentinel-Observer. It was not a photograph of Tommy, though his name appeared in the article beneath it. It was not a photograph of Detective Whitfield, though his name appeared there too. It was a photograph of a large man in a leather vest, asleep in a hospital waiting room chair. Arms folded, chin dropped toward his chest, the Hells Angels patch on his back fully visible. while the morning shift moved through the corridor around him with the practiced efficiency of people who had long since learned to work around what couldn't be moved. He had fallen asleep somewhere around 5 in the morning, in the quiet interval between finishing what needed to be done and being told he could go home. Nurse Alison Parks had taken the photo on her phone. She admitted this to Hazel at her next follow-up appointment, with a candor that bordered on embarrassment. "I walked past twice," she said. "I couldn't stop looking at it. There was something about it I felt like I needed to keep." The photograph ran under the headline, "The Man Nobody Expected." Ryder called Hazel the morning it published. "They didn't need to do that," he said. "You're a good story," she told him. "I'm a private person. You were asleep in a public hospital with your name on your vest." A pause. "Then you gave them my name." "I told them the truth," she said. "Same as you did for me." The pause on his end of the line was the kind that happens when someone has been outmaneuvered by logic they can't honestly refute. "Fair enough," he said finally, and she heard in it something very close to laughter. Thomas Reed was arraigned on charges of criminal threatening of a pregnant person, a Class D felony under Tennessee law, along with aggravated stalking and criminal harassment. The recorded evidence left his public defender with very little room to work. At the arraignment, Tommy sat in his pressed jacket and spoke quietly to his attorney, and there were people in the gallery who found themselves, initially, wondering whether the situation had been misread. He had that quality, had always had it. The 11-minute recording was the honest version of who he was, spoken in his own voice, in his own words, in a moment when he'd believed no one was listening. He was held without bail pending trial, the judge citing the explicit and documented nature of threats made against a pregnant woman. Hazel moved into a short-term rental near the university, with help from a domestic advocacy organization that had contacted her after the Sentinel Observer story ran. She was 8 weeks from her due date. She had weekly OB appointments at UT Medical Center, and Nurse Parks had left her personal contact information the morning of her discharge, not as an official referral, but as a human one, offered without fanfare and without being asked. Parks caught her in the hallway at her follow-up. "I want to say something to you," she said. "The night you came in, when I saw who was with you, I made a judgment before I had anything to make it with." She said it plainly, without softening the edges of it. "I was wrong about who I needed to be concerned about." "You weren't the only one," Hazel said. Parks looked at the hallway, then back at her. "How is he?" "He's not exactly a progress report kind of person." Parks almost smiled. "No, I imagine he isn't." The full shape of Ryder Calloway was something Hazel came to understand, gradually. The way people reveal themselves, not in summaries but in details. A sentence offered and then left alone. Something said in the middle of a task, when the more practiced defenses have gone quiet. He didn't offer his history as a case for himself. He offered it the way a person does when they've decided something is worth saying, and trust the listener to take it on its own terms. He was 44. 19 years with the Knoxville chapter. Before that, 2 years in the Army, construction work in Georgia, a stint at a refinery in Louisiana, and eventually Knoxville because a friend needed a roommate, and it had seemed as reasonable a destination as anywhere else. He'd been briefly married in his late 20s, a woman named Beth, who had left not for the reasons most people assumed when they learned what he was, but for simpler and more honest reasons. She had wanted a life built around a certain kind of stability, and the choices he'd made had foreclosed that life, and they had both eventually understood this. He didn't blame her. He had spent a long time not blaming her, and now he mostly didn't think about it. He had a daughter, Emma, 19 years old. She lived in Nashville with her mother. He told Hazel about Emma on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after everything, when he came over to help move boxes from a storage unit to the new apartment. He offered the information the way he offered most personal things, briefly, without ceremony, in the matter-of-fact tone of someone who has decided something deserves to be said and doesn't require anything additional from the saying of it. Emma had grown up knowing of him without knowing him, in the way children sometimes know a parent from a distance when circumstances make proximity complicated. His presence in her childhood had been the presence of a weather system, affecting things without being there. For most of her adolescence, the picture she'd been given of him had been assembled from second-hand accounts and from what she could see in the photographs her mother had kept, the ink, the vest, the company he kept. The picture had frightened her, as it frightened most people, because it had been taken at face value, and the face value was what it was. In the past 2 years, they had been talking. Carefully, the way you talk to someone when there is a great deal of complicated history, and you have both decided, without quite saying so, to try. She saw the newspaper, he said, setting a box down in the hallway of the new apartment. Hazel looked at him. She texted me. He reached into the pocket of his jeans, held the phone out to her. The text read, "Dad, I saw the article. I'm really proud of you. I think I've always known you were this person. I'm sorry it took me so long to see it." Hazel handed the phone back without speaking. There are moments that carry a weight that additional words only diminish. Ryder looked at the text for another second. Then he put the phone in his pocket, said, "2 more boxes in the truck," and went back down the stairs. She stood alone in the hallway of her new apartment in the afternoon light and thought about what it costs a person to be misread for a very long time, and what it means when someone finally, clearly, in their own words, sees them right. On a clear morning in late November, Hazel called Ryder from the maternity ward at UT Medical Center. "She's here," she said. A pause. "You both okay?" "Both good." The pause that followed was longer, warmer. "You have a name?" Hazel looked at the window. The Tennessee sky beyond the glass was the particular clean blue that only arrives when the temperature drops below 40 and the air has gone absolutely still. The kind of blue that makes everything look both further and closer than it actually is. "Lena," she said, "after the diner." Ryder was quiet for a moment. "That's a good name," he said. "I know." Detective Bruce Whitfield submitted an internal review request the week after the Sentinel-Observer story ran, citing the original handling of Hazel Brennan's complaint at the Knox County Police Department. It was a voluntary action. Nothing in departmental protocol required it, and he had not been asked to file it by anyone above him. In the request, he wrote that a private citizen with no law enforcement training had, in the course of a single evening, compiled and organized evidence sufficient to effect an arrest in a case that a 30-year veteran had evaluated, dismissed, and closed in under 40 minutes. He wrote that this was not a failure of procedure. He wrote that it was a failure of attention, the kind that happens when a person walks into a room and decides, before they have learned anything true about the situation in front of them, that they already know what they're looking at. It was a small act. Most honest acts of self-examination inside large institutions are small. That does not make them nothing. Ryder Calloway left Knoxville on a Tuesday morning in early December, heading west on I-40 toward Nashville. The temperature was 38 degrees, and the sky was pale as winter bone. He wasn't leaving the city. He had an apartment on the west side, a chapter, responsibilities he didn't abandon, but he was going to Nashville for a few days. There was someone there he was working to know better, in the patient, unhurried way that you have to know people you love when there have been years of silence and distance between you and what you're trying to become to each other. He passed Lena's diner on Cumberland Avenue on his way out of the city. The sign still read Lena's in faded red letters above the door. The apostrophe was still missing. He didn't stop. He thought about a grey October afternoon. A woman with green eyes and both hands resting over her belly. A folder on a phone screen labeled "Proof" in capital letters. The specific quality of the silence in a diner when a person finally stops performing calm and tells you the truth. He thought about 3 words he'd said to her that had cost him nothing at all and had apparently meant everything. "I believe you." He thought about all the ways that fear, dressed up as caution, as instinct, as common sense, as the simple refusal to look past the first available surface, produces the same outcome: people in genuine trouble, standing in front of people who could genuinely help, being told there is nothing to be done. He thought about Tommy Reed in his pressed jacket and his easy smile, who had never in his life frightened a single person on sight. He thought about Lena, 4 days old, in a room in a city where she was already safer than she'd been before she arrived. The highway opened ahead of him. The engine beneath him was loud and familiar and constant. The Cumberland Mountains in the distance were blue-gray against the pale winter sky, and the road between here and Nashville was long and clear. He rode toward it,